Steve looked at his wife of 7 years. A little angrily, he said, "It's last minute. Couldn't you have reported this earlier?" Catherine, more commonly called Katie or Kat, responded sharply, "Would it have made a difference if you had found out a month ago? You're always at home anyway. Now you know. I also have work and tasks, and I—" "Is this a joke instead of work?" Kat interrupted him. "Do not make me laugh. This is a hobby. Nothing more. Your job is to run the house." Steve was stunned. He looked at his wife, silently seething with anger. Finally, he stood up and said bitterly, "It's good to know your place in this marriage. Housekeeper with benefits. If I received comments like this from my employer, it might be time to resign. Well, I have 2 weeks to think about it while the boss is away. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a hobby to take up." Kat looked at her husband's disappearing back. She muttered to herself, "Damn, this didn't go well. We should have done better." She thought about it. Indeed, Steve's income was much less impressive than hers, but he stopped working full-time when she received 2 promotions in 1 year. Steve could easily match her income if he worked full-time. He took better care of the household than she ever could, but most importantly, he took better care of her 14-year-old daughter than she did herself. They were soul mates from the moment they met 8 years ago. Miranda shared everything with Steve and told him everything. Steve was even responsible for Miranda's sex education and bought her her first sanitary pads. His work remained in the background for her sake. She also realized that her boss's flirting and compliments were starting to affect her. He always spoke disparagingly about Steve. According to Robert Don Jr., the man in the home should be responsible for the family's income and not ride on the back of his wife. She felt flattered and sexy with him, and his innuendos began to take root in her mind. Steve Paulson was 26 years old when he met Catherine Brandt, who was 5 years older, at a party hosted by a friend of Steve's. Steve and his friend were members of a bird-watching club, although Steve was much less fanatical than the rest of the club members. He was tolerated thanks to his small inventions, such as an automatic telescope tracker. When the bird was close to the center of the telescope's field of view, a button would be pressed, and the telescope would remain aimed and in focus even as the bird flew away. The camera automatically continued filming. Steve had just graduated from university with a PhD in nanotechnology engineering and a master's degree in industrial design, and was freelancing for big companies and making good money. His friends wished him well, and after 2 years without a girlfriend, they began sending women his way. But Steve was careful. He came out of a very toxic relationship in which his fiancée kept him on a leash for almost a year after he found out she cheated on him. She tried to reconcile, but Steve eventually discovered that it was just a deception to gain access to his developments. Steve was in love with her, and his fiancée almost literally held him in one place. She even hired a divorce lawyer to get what she wanted because she lived with Steve for the last 6 months of their relationship. To no avail and with a high lawyer's bill. At a party hosted by a friend from a bird-watching club, Steve and Kat were almost automatically thrown together because everyone else was only talking about birds or bird-related topics. Steve was a slender man with wiry muscles who loved running and rock climbing. He was not a climber, but he was a serious boulderer and sport climber, as his calloused hands and wide wrists showed. His climbing level was above 5th, almost at a professional level. He wore glasses that hid his greenish-brown eyes. He had unruly auburn hair and wore clothes slightly larger than his size. Steve was a good conversationalist and could talk about a wide range of topics. However, he would withdraw when the conversation became personal. At first, Catherine wanted nothing to do with him. She, too, saw Steve as just another blind date arranged for her. Steve seemed to understand this and left her alone after a few polite words. When Catherine had to go home because of a babysitter, her official beau was nowhere to be seen. The host of the party called Steve for help, since Steve very rarely drank alcohol, and this time was no exception. So Catherine found herself in Steve's luxury SUV on the way to her house, explaining why she had a 7-year-old daughter when Steve suddenly said, "I've planned a no-strings-attached weekend, going to the zoo and going for a drive around the lake tomorrow. If your daughter likes zoos, I'd love to invite you both to the day." "Why do you invite complete strangers to the zoo?" Catherine asked suspiciously. "Because most kids like zoos, and I like kids. And I'm guessing you won't want me to go alone with your daughter, so I'm inviting you both." Catherine thought about it. It would be a nice change from the standard weekend routine, and yes, Miranda really liked zoos. Plus, her laptop will be out of reach, and a little rest will do her good. She worked for an investment firm that bought small, promising companies on behalf of the big ones, before they could become serious threats, or because the big companies wanted their ideas. The pressure to do everything right was unrelenting, so her laptop was always on. The next day was a stunning success, and from the moment Miranda and Steve met, they became best friends. At first, Steve came only to see Miranda, while Catherine slowly fell in love with this kind man. After 3 months of hunting and flirting, trying to get a reaction from Steve, she was tired of it. After another day at the lake, where Steve helped her daughter overcome her fear of water, they had dinner. After a pleasant dinner, while Steve was telling Miranda a bedtime story, Catherine undressed in front of the mirror and examined her body. She was a slightly plump blonde with large eyes and generous lips and a round face with high cheekbones. But she was in good shape with a height of 170 cm. She had large breasts, a flat stomach, and a beautiful ass. The only thing she didn't like about herself was her legs. She thought they were short and too stocky. She left the bathroom and waited outside Miranda's room when Steve came out, his back to her. Kat called his name, and when he turned, she pressed herself against him and said with a racing heart, "My bedroom is the other way. I want a bedtime story too." Catherine led him into the bedroom, pulled his head down, and kissed him with such passion that she surprised even herself. She couldn't hold back any longer and started tearing his clothes. Steve was an attentive and gentle lover. His ex-fiancée taught him a lot, a lot. 9 months later, they got married. Catherine didn't sleep well. Steve never left his office. When she asked him to go to bed, he flatly refused. Now they were having breakfast. She asked, "Are you still mad at me?" Steve looked at her with anger in his eyes. "You have no idea. When you return, we will have a serious conversation about whether this marriage is worth saving. Over the past few months, your attitude towards me, and more importantly, towards Miranda, has been disgusting and is getting worse every day." Catherine looked down at her plate. "Sorry, I've been under a lot of pressure lately. Can we talk about this while you take me to the airport?" Steve exploded. "What's wrong with you?" "No, I cannot. I'm a housekeeper, a nanny, and a punching bag, but not a driver. And when was the last time you looked at a calendar? Today is a parent meeting. At 10 a.m. It's been there for months. Do you remember the last time you looked at him or went to see your daughter at school? And now, if you'll excuse me, I have other things to do." Steve walked out of the kitchen, leaving his wife in shock. He had never lost his temper before and had never yelled at her. She also felt deep shame. He was right about Miranda. He was more of a father to her than she was a mother. She ordered a taxi, and when it arrived, Steve had already left without saying goodbye. In the taxi, her frustration turned to anger. How dare he treat her like that? Wasn't she the one who brought home the money for their comfortable life and his stupid hobbies? He could have at least said goodbye. After all, she was leaving for 2 weeks. 2 days later, Steve was working on the project. This could mean a new order and stable income for the coming years. He had dinner with Miranda, and according to an iron rule, he stayed with her until she went to bed. After that, he returned to his office again. He stretched and saw his reflection in the window. "You're getting soft, old man. Look at that belly." There was almost nothing there, but it was too much for Steve to feel comfortable. He decided to do something about it and found a gym online, or better yet, an indoor climbing wall with a gym. He found exactly what he was looking for. As he finished filling out the form, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a friend from the bird watching club. Steve found this strange because it had been a long time since he had interacted with these people. However, he decided to answer. "Harry, long time no see. How can I help?" "Steve, may I ask, are you still married to that Brant woman?" "Yes, although we have some problems now." "I don't know how to tell you this, so I'll just start. I saw your wife at the Bird Island Resort, and I have bad news for you." "Continue. I won't shoot the messenger." "I'm listening," Steve replied. An ice ball began to form in his stomach. Suddenly, he had a premonition of what he would hear. "She's there with some guys and another woman, and they're doing dirty things. They don't worry about anything and don't notice that there are also people in the bird sanctuary with high-end cameras with very powerful telephoto lenses." "Does that mean you have pictures of them?" "Yes, and although they may think they don't have a GSM connection, the club does have a satellite phone with internet. I can send them." "Harry, I am very grateful to you. Can you do me a favor and shoot some more?" "I can do better. I can take them on video. Their bungalows and pool are less than 1,000 feet from the bird-watching hut, and we have an uninterrupted view. They do too, but they don't pay attention to their surroundings." "Thank you. Can you send me what you already have? I still have the same email address. And thanks for the warning. Now I understand why she treated us like that." Half an hour later, Steve was looking at 10 high-resolution photographs confirming Catherine's infidelity. He began to cry. It took him most of the night to get his emotions under control. After that, he got to work. "Among the first things I did was open an offshore bank account and start my own industrial design and engineering company." 9 days later, Catherine had had enough. What started out as an exciting strategy and political session for 2 weeks turned into something very dirty. Her boss finally broke her barriers, and because she was angry and upset, she allowed herself to be seduced. Now she only felt used and ashamed. Luckily, she didn't allow any photographs to be taken. Catherine suggested that since there was no reception, the phone should be left in the resort safe along with the passports. Her companions were already half drunk and simply agreed. Now it was Friday afternoon. The day after tomorrow, they began their journey back. If all goes well, she will be home on Monday. Meanwhile, Steve was not idle either. He received updates from Bird Island until the Wednesday evening before Catherine returned. That day, his friend left the island. Steve went through his contacts and found what he wanted: a law firm for which he did some design work as a favor to a friend. One of their lawyers was a bird fanatic. He called them and made an appointment. That same Friday, as Catherine was evaluating her vacation, Steve went to meet Miranda's mentor, Noah Don, at school. He explained to her that he and Catherine were getting a divorce and that Catherine would receive the papers on Tuesday. He didn't need to explain that this would have a devastating effect on Miranda. He also stressed that if Miranda needed anything, he would have to be called, and gave her his new phone number. On Friday morning, Steve had a difficult conversation with his father-in-law and mother-in-law. Robert, his father-in-law, asked, "Are you sure you can't cope and overcome this?" "No, sir. I can show you pictures and convince you of this in an instant. I do not want to do this. Please, sir, I'm doing this for a reason. I'll bring Miranda over at the end of the day so I can pack my things and Miranda can have one last quiet weekend for a long time to come." Martha, his mother-in-law, cried quietly, hugged him and said, "Please don't become a stranger. Let us know how you're coping." Steve didn't answer, kissed Martha softly on the forehead and left. On Friday night, Catherine told the man to call it quits. She didn't want to play anymore. She was in pain and wanted to get his dirt out of her system before meeting her husband again. She had to go through several obstacles at home. She believed that she would have a huge job in appeasing her husband and convincing him that she loved him. Her boss, Robert Jr., tried to talk her into it again because he didn't think it would matter. Catherine promised him that if he tried, he would go home without the body part he loved most. When Catherine is half asleep as she flew through Sunday night into Monday morning, a small voice began to torment her, and the voice became more and more insistent. Suddenly, she sat up straight. The magnitude of what she had done in the last 14 days had literally sunk into her. Dawn was breaking outside when the guilt almost overwhelmed her. Her only consolation was that Steve would never find out, and she decided to make amends to him for the rest of her life. Tired and hungry, Catherine sat in the back of a taxi heading home. All she wanted was a bath, some sleep, and to be ready to meet her husband when her phone rang. Unfamiliar number. Catherine Brandt is listening. This is Robert Don S.R., secretary. They're expecting you to be at the office at 11. It's still my vacation. I'm dead tired. If you value your job, you would be wise to show up. Have a nice day. Catherine sighed heavily. Now she only had time to shower and go to the office. At 11, she entered the conference room. Besides her, there was her boss, two others from vacation, a woman and an older man whom she did not recognize. Her boss looked sick and trembled every time the older man looked at him. The older man began without introduction. On Friday a week ago, I had a visitor with extremely disturbing news. As a result, my son has been relieved of his position at this company. Now you three explain to me what the purpose of this vacation on Bird Island was. When she heard those words, it took all her self-control not to have a bowel movement. Her female colleague tried to explain. We were developing a new acquisition strategy. Mr. Don snorted contemptuously. Fornication? 2 whole weeks? There must be some kind of strategy. But you must think I'm an idiot. But not me. This person reminded me of the protocols and rules of this company. These are the rules you signed and agreed to when all 3 of you signed your new contract 4 months ago. This man was not stupid. He came in here with a lawyer and kept this company, so there was nothing I could do except settle the matter. Let me enlighten you on this. Mr. T. Don looked at the now very pale faces of Catherine and her 2 other colleagues. He waited for the message to reach them. He then ruthlessly continued, First of all, your spouses will receive all the evidence of your sex party in the mail today. If they decide to divorce, I will have to pay for their lawyer. And damn, he found one of the best. Secondly, I am not allowed to fire you, except for this piece of shit who calls himself my son. And I can't let you break the contract and leave too. So you belong to me for life. From now on, your careers are stopped. Any bonus, if there is one, will go towards covering the costs of lawyers. There are other things, but they don't concern you. If you have any questions, ask them to my lawyer who is sitting there. He pointed to the unknown woman. If there are no questions, get out of my sight. Mr. Don S.R. left the room. Catherine jumped out of her chair and almost ran to her car. She needed to be home before the mail arrived to intercept it. She's never been so fast. Her ride back was barely within the city speed limit. Catherine opened the door and shouted, "Honey," she shouted again, louder this time, "Steve." Still no answer. She took a deep breath and exhaled with relief. Thank God he's not home yet, she said out loud and thought. Now I can get some sleep before the mail arrives. She lay down on the sofa and, due to extreme fatigue, fell asleep. She was awakened by the ringing of the phone. It was her mother. Catherine, are you going to pick Miranda up from school, or do you want us to do it? Mom, why are you asking? Of course, Steve. He always does it. Honey, I don't think this will happen again. We'll take Miranda. You're already too late. Let her stay one more night. During this time, Steve was having a difficult and emotional conversation with Miranda. Miranda's mentor, Miss Noah Dawn, was also there for support. He decided to be honest about what happened without too many details. He began without preamble. Miranda, I'm going to divorce your mother. Miranda had tears in her eyes, but she didn't look very surprised. She replied, because she's been treating you like crap for the past few months. No, everything is much worse. She cheated on me. I was ready to discuss the attitude she showed towards us. Yes, she treated you badly too. And you are her daughter. What will happen now? Miranda asked with tears in her eyes. First and foremost, I will always try to take care of you. Miss Dawn has my new phone number. I won't give it to you because I'm sure Catherine will try to pressure you into giving it. Keep in mind that I will listen to voicemail on my old number every evening, but I will never answer calls. What will happen next? Don't know. Catherine will receive the documents tomorrow morning at work. I don't know how she will react, but there's a chance she'll try to stop us from seeing each other just to annoy me. This weekend, I moved out of my house. I live nearby, and I already have a large order. So I'll be fine financially, just like your mother. I took care of that too. Miranda was inconsolable, and they sat together for a long time. Steve finally left, not noticing the looks Noah Dawn was giving him. She told Miranda, "This is an amazing person. He will take care of you, whether your mother wants it or not." Thinking, it's a pity that he is a man and not a woman otherwise, but I'm going to tear my brother to pieces. This bastard, not knowing that her father had already done this, albeit for different reasons. Steve went to his new home. It was a house with a workshop adjacent to it. It was too big for him alone, but that was part of the deal Steve had made with Robert Dawn. The house and land were surplus from the acquisition of Donna's company. It cost them little. A financial settlement would have been very expensive, and the house was exactly what Steve liked. This house and a written contract stating that his new company was never to be taken over. The rather secluded house was in need of some renovation and improvement. The interior was very simple, but suited for the moment. The house had 5 rooms, of which 3 were bedrooms. One bedroom had a bathroom. Downstairs there was a living room and a smaller room that he could use as a gym, a large kitchen, and a bathroom with a shower. There are 3 bedrooms upstairs. The house was oriented east to west with a veranda, a small balcony on the east side, and a large one on the west. The large workshop contained a self-contained living space with 1 room, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. All this was located on a large plot of wooded land. Catherine sat in the living room, looking at her phone in disbelief. She was completely taken aback by the speed with which Steve reacted. She still didn't realize that it was Steve, with the help of a friend, who caught her cheating. She pressed the speed dial button for Steve's number. It went straight to voicemail. Annoyed, she almost shouted, "Steve, please call me. We need to talk. I know I treated you like crap. You must give me a chance to redeem myself. Call me." Steve didn't look at his phone that evening. He went to bed. Catherine went to bed too, but not before filling Steve's voicemail with pleas for him to call back. Both had trouble sleeping. Steve because he was still angry and very upset. Catherine was just very afraid. Robert S.R. told her and colleagues that evidence would come in the mail, but her mailbox remained empty. After a restless night, it's time to go to work. She got out of bed and showered again, but still felt dirty. She checked her phone. There was nothing from my husband there. She felt terrible when she left the house. Catherine thought it was irresponsible to drive in this condition, but she drove to the office anyway. Her trip was uneventful. Traffic jams were a part of her life. When she arrived and entered the office, her assistant said, "You have a visitor waiting for you." Catherine's heart jumped. She thought, "Visitor? Steve," and went inside. She found a woman waiting for her. "Are you Catherine Brandt?" Catherine answered in the affirmative. The woman handed her an envelope and asked her to sign it. Catherine had no choice but to sign. The woman then said, "Sorry, you were handed documents," and walked away. Catherine's legs gave way and she sank into a chair. When her assistant came in to see if she was needed, she saw a confused woman looking anxiously at a plain brown envelope. She heard the rumors, but never expected to face the consequences. "I think I know what's in this envelope, but I'm afraid to open it. Can you open it and tell me?" Assistant Catherine opened the envelope and looked inside. Blushing, she said, "I don't think I want to see the rest of the contents, and I don't think you want me to see them either. One look was too much. You can count on my discretion." And she handed over the envelope and hurried out. Catherine pulled out the contents and gasped. The Bird Island brochure has been released. She boasted that it was the best place for bird watching in the country. It was a photo of a bird watcher with a camera with a huge telephoto lens. Some photographs were attached to the brochure. The photographs left little to the imagination. Adult magazines would pay a fortune for them, and she was featured in all of them. Finally, it dawned on her. One of Steve's friends made them and told Steve. He knew all along and didn't leave her simply because of her attitude. Now she realized that she had completely lost her husband, and there was not the slightest chance of reconciliation. At the end of the day, Catherine went to her parents' house to pick up Miranda. She felt terrible. She wasn't sure what to expect when she got there. Could she have embellished the story a little? When she opened the door, it was immediately clear that embellishment was not an option. Her father took her into the living room asking, "What were you thinking? You are crazy. Neglect and throw this person away. How could you? What about Miranda? Who will take care of her?" In the living room, Miranda looked at Catherine with fury in her eyes and shouted, "Well, thank you, Mother. Years of neglect, months of bad words and verbal abuse, and now this. You really must hate us." Catherine didn't know what to say, but Miranda didn't finish. "You're going for a divorce, and you can be sure that I'll ask the judge so I can live with Steve. After all, he is the one who raised and took care of me for the last 5 years while you were an absentee parent." Catherine's mother came to the rescue. "Miranda, stop it. It's already hard for your mother. You don't need to add to that. We better start planning how to handle this situation because Steve is no longer there to take care of you now." A year and a half after Bird Island, mysterious sounds from Pink Floyd's Echoes came through Steve's workplace. Metal was one of his favorite albums. Steve was concentrating on designing a robot for cleaning aquariums. But not only the bottom and glass walls. The robot had to be able to clean everything inorganic in the tank. Steve straightened up and did a few exercises to clear his mind. He recognized them when he went to a psychologist. The betrayal and subsequent divorce hit him hard. When the court denied Steve contact with Miranda, and he was unable to care for her as promised, his mind locked itself in a dungeon and threw away the key. It took months and the help of a good friend to get back to normal. The divorce itself was not a problem. Catherine did not resist and herself offered to pay child support for 5 years because Steve's career had gone by the wayside for the sake of her career. Steve tried to refuse, but Catherine wouldn't hear of it. She blamed herself and accepted the consequences, tearfully telling him the last time they spoke to each other. Steve reluctantly accepted the money and put it in a trust fund for Miranda. He didn't need them. As Steve tried to clear his mind of the clutter that was preventing him from finding breakthrough inspiration, his cell phone rang. Paulson is listening. He heard a hesitant but familiar voice on the other end. "Steve, please don't hang up." "Martha," he exclaimed in surprise. "Of course not. How are you? How did you get this number?" "From Miranda's former mentor. You told her that if Miranda needed help, you would be available. She has been promoted and is now deputy director." Martha paused before continuing, "She really needs your help, even if she won't admit it." "I will be there. Just tell me what to do." "We can't do this over the phone. Can you meet us somewhere? With us is Robert, me, and Catherine." It was obvious to Steve that it took Martha all her courage to call him and turn on Catherine. He said softly, "Mart, I will meet the devil himself if it helps Miranda. You know it, and Cat hardly deserves such a description. Why don't you come and see me? I'm still stuck with my job." "What? To come to you? Is it true? Okay. What's the address?" Martha stuttered and asked with relief. Steve gave Martha his address. At this point, he had already renovated and furnished the first floor, 1 bedroom and bathrooms, so everything looked more or less decent. Much of its interior was from a store that sold furniture displayed in stores or at fairs. The only thing he splurged on was a top-of-the-line media center and his own bed. He renovated the bathrooms himself. The one on the ground floor was now directly accessible from the room Steve had converted into a gym. The upstairs bathroom was completely redone. Steve added a large walk-in shower using an outdated jacuzzi tub and installed a bathtub. He always preferred the shower to the bath. Only when he was extremely tired or stressed did he like to take a bath. 45 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Steve opened the door and saw three very nervous people. "Come on in, I do not bite," and he led them into the living room. They looked around in a large room while Steve watched Catherine. She looked exhausted, black circles under dull eyes. Her shoulders slumped as she looked at Steve and said, "You look good. Are you all right?" "Physically, I'm fine. Mentally, not so good. I need a consultant to help me move forward." Catherine shed tears and whispered almost to herself, "And it's all my fault." Steve decided to ignore her comment and asked if they wanted something to drink before they started. They refused. "Then tell me what the problem is." Catherine tried to answer, but instead began to sob. Her parents didn't look much better. The only thing Steve could think about was crouching down in front of Catherine, hugging her and rocking her gently. "I have you. Is it so bad? Why didn't you come earlier?" Catherine wailed. "I was afraid you hated me too much." Steve responded, surprised. "Hate you? I don't hate you. I still love you, but I can't live with the thought that if another man comes along and starts sweet talk, you'll treat me like crap and spread your legs for him again." This caused another bout of crying. Steve turned to his former relatives. "Tell me, what's the matter? You said it had something to do with Miranda." Miranda became completely uncontrollable. She blames her mother for everything. She's doing so poorly in school that she probably won't be allowed next year, and now she's missing. "What does this have to do with me? I'm still not her father." Martha replied, "We can make you Miranda's official guardian. We already have papers drawn up by a lawyer. All you have to do is sign them, and we can go to the judge to formalize them." "You seemed pretty confident that I would agree." "No, no, no, absolutely not. But if you agree, we wanted to get this organized as quickly as possible. This is really very urgent." Without hesitation, Steve agreed and promised to contact Miranda as soon as he could find her. Miranda sat on a dirty sofa with a cigarette in her hand and a lighter in the other. A man sat in a chair opposite the sofa and looked at her intently. Suddenly, the door opened and two men entered. One skinny man accompanied by another. The second man, Steve's friend, was a Krav Maga instructor. Steve looked around and then at Miranda. He said softly, "Now this is disappointing. I thought I taught you better. How are you doing, girl?" Miranda looked up. Looking a little drunk, she squealed happily, "Steve, what are you doing here?" "I came to get you out of here, and I see that I'm just in time." The man in the chair, out of nowhere, took out a long knife, jumped up from the chair and growled, "She's not going anywhere." That was as far as he could go before Steve's friend kicked him back into his chair. He gave up and remained sitting still, looking wearily at his friend Steve. Steve crouched down in front of Miranda, snatched the cigarette from her hand and asked, "Did he give you this?" Miranda nodded. Steve called the police and explained what he found upon entering. He looked at Miranda and asked, "Do you want me to be your guardian?" Miranda looked surprised. "Will you come back?" "No, your mother and I are done, but she's beside herself with concern for you. I will be in your life again, and you can stay with me whenever necessary. As your guardian, I am partially responsible for you and am allowed to accompany you." The police arrived and arrested the male protester. One of them told Steve, "We need you to testify tomorrow, sir." Steve nodded that he understood, turned to the girl and asked, "He didn't touch you, did he?" "No," Miranda replied. "Good," Steve said, relieved. "Miranda, do you need time to think?" "No. Of course I want you to be my guardian. Can I call you Daddy sometimes?" Where did this come from? Steve thought for a moment and said, "Yes, you can, but only if we're alone or when you think I'm too strict. Shall we go now?" An hour later, Steve opened the front door and let Miranda into his house. She looked around in amazement. "This is huge," she exclaimed. Steve responded, "Go and explore. I'll call your mother and tell her I found you. Only my office is unavailable. Cappies? Miranda looked startled and asked quietly, "What are you going to tell her?" "That I found you. Nothing more. But if there's a next time, I have to tell your mother. Tomorrow we'll talk seriously about expectations. Now explore and find yourself a room that we can turn into your bedroom." The phone conversation with Catherine was brief. She cried with relief and could only say a few words of thank you. After the conversation ended, Steve went to look for his ward. He found her. He sleeps on his bed with a slight smile on his face. Steve covered her with a blanket and went down to the kitchen. When she wakes up, she will need to drink a lot and eat normally. Miranda woke up with a dry mouth and a throbbing headache. She panicked when she didn't recognize her surroundings and didn't move until Steve poked his head around the door to check on her. "Hello, Sonia. Can you come down? The detective and the nurse want to see you because they need blood samples from you. Can you handle this?" Miranda chuckled as she tried to sit up. She was dizzy and felt terrible. Steve helped her downstairs. The detective met them and explained, "Did you drink alcohol?" Miranda croaked, "No, just a glass of iced tea." "A glass, not a tin can that you had to open." "Cup. What does all of this mean?" "And when you drank it, did you feel anything after that?" "Yes, I felt funny and very relaxed." "They spiked the drink, young lady. We need your blood samples. It is known that the man you were with forced young girls into the sex trade. Your stepfather was just in time. I believe you have a headache right now." Miranda nodded affirmatively. The nurse took the samples, and she and the detective left after Miranda testified. The next day, Steve went with his ward to school. He wanted to talk to her mentor. Miranda didn't like this idea at all. After the divorce, she was able to manipulate her mother into accepting almost everything. She knew for a fact that she shouldn't even have tried this with Steve. She told him while they were in the car, "I have a new mentor. You know, I don't think I like her very much. Your mother told me. It seems like a good idea to introduce yourself, even if it's not official yet, that I will become your guardian. When your mother and I divorced, the court forbade me to interfere." The rest of the trip passed in silence. Miranda led Steve into her mentor's office and knocked. "Come in," it sounded muffled from behind the door. Steve opened the door and looked at the woman at the desk. Rachel Garland looked straight at him. At 35, she was a tall and slender woman with auburn hair cut short, dark green eyes, and freckles on her oval face. Her skin was pale white, almost transparent, as is the case with red-haired people. She had small breasts for her figure and a narrow waist. She sat upright in the high-backed chair at her desk. She studied Steve and finally said, "Miranda, again you skipped class despite my warnings. What do you say to that? And who is this man?" Steve stepped forward, extended his hand, and said, "Let me introduce myself. I'm Steve Powelson. I will soon become Miranda's official guardian. That's why I came to introduce myself." Rachel Garland came from a very wealthy family. Her father Robert made his fortune trading raw materials for the iron industry. He married late to a much younger woman. It was an unhappy marriage, not because they didn't love each other. She was deeply depressed. She bore him 2 children before committing suicide, leaving behind sadness and grief. The children were raised by her sister and later in boarding schools. The father could not cope with the loss of his wife, raising children and running a multi-million-dollar company. His sister took care of the children, but was deprived of love for them. She simply loved living the life of a rich woman and felt entitled to it. The only thing she instilled in both children was contempt for people who worked with their hands, and this was reinforced by the boarding schools she chose for her nephew and niece. When Rachel shook Steve's hand, she felt the calluses and noticed the spade-shaped tips of his fingers. Working class, she thought with contempt. She completely missed the fact that Steve's eyes sparkled with intelligence and didn't miss a thing. There was something she couldn't put her finger on, so she decided to show the man his place. Rachel responded somewhat abruptly. "If that's the case, we have a lot to talk about. I suggest you make an appointment as soon as everything is official." Until then, I suggest you stay away from the school premises." Rachel didn't give time for her words to sink in and turned to Miranda without giving him a second glance. "Young lady, this is the last time we will discuss this. Next time, it will be suspension or expulsion." Steve recognized this as a blunt dismissal, turned and walked away without saying a word. Rachel inwardly sighed with relief and thought he had gotten the message. Okay, one less problem. It's manageable. After a short pause, she asked Miranda, "Who was it?" Miranda, a little offended by the way Miss Garland had treated Steve, responded sharply, "That's my mother's ex-husband. He's going to take care of me." Rachel was a little confused. "So this is your father?" "No, but I really wish there was." "Do you know why they got divorced?" "Yes, and I don't want to talk about it. If you want to know, ask my mother." Rachel was shocked by the venomous tone in which Miranda answered her questions. She decided to leave it at that for a while. 2 weeks later, Steve was now Miranda's official guardian and was once again sitting in front of Rachel in her office. Rachel began, "Now that you are here in an official capacity, we better get to know each other. Can you tell me about yourself?" Steve didn't like people prying into his personal life. He told her about his work, although he downplayed its importance. He forgot to mention his education. He said he runs half marathons, without mentioning his bouldering expeditions to the City of Rocks National Forest in Idaho, or a planned vacation to Fontainebleau in France, near Paris. He had already mapped out the rocks he wanted to conquer on the Fontainebleau website and couldn't wait. Rachel began to hate this man. He seemed to talk openly about himself, but she still knew very little about him. How did he become Miranda's guardian? She asked herself. She had to admit that already Miranda's results were starting to improve, as was her attitude at school. Rachel decided to take a chance and ask, "You divorced her mother, didn't you? And you're not Miranda's father? This is right?" Steve thought, "This is it. He gets into personal things out of curiosity because he can't catch me." He replied, "That's right." Rachel waited, hoping Steve would begin to explain. She knew that people were uncomfortable with silence in conversation and would almost automatically reveal more than they wanted to in order to fill the gap. But not this man, to her disappointment. Now she had to go on and reconsider her views on this man. He was much smarter than he seemed. She asked almost demandingly, "Can you tell me about the divorce? What was the reason?" Steve was taken aback by this direct approach and began to get annoyed. He made his irritation clear in his response. "I can, but I won't. You'll have to ask Miranda's mother. I think it's enough to say that there was a marital incident that could not be overcome." "Yeah," Rachel thought, "you cheated. You're a creep, and you don't even have the courage to admit it openly. Coward." After a few seconds, she said, "I think we're done. Thank you for your time." Steve walked to the door, turned, and said with contempt, "This wasn't an introduction. This was an interrogation, and I don't know what I did to deserve this. But please note that if I even suspect that you are mistreating Miranda, I will give you a hard time." Rachel's jaw dropped as she watched the door close. This parting remark made her wary. This man didn't really care about how she treated him, but he did care a lot about how she treated his ward. He showed that he was very protective of the girl. She might not like him, but she would have to be careful about how she treated Miranda. Over time, Rachel noticed that several student scores improved significantly, including Miranda's. This was fine with her because her first encounter with Miranda's guardian was still fresh in her mind. She had other conversations with Mr. Paulson, as she still called him, and during them he was icily formal. She was now looking out the classroom window and noticed Miranda's guardian's car. Miranda and 5 other students sat in a big SUV, laughing and joking. She was surprised that the man who acted so coldly towards some people had 6 laughing children in the car. A few days later, Noah Dawn knocked and entered Rachel's office. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. "Certainly." Rachel responded in surprise, thinking, "But why here, and not in your office? Is this idiot complaining about me?" Noah took a deep breath and began, I received a request from some of your students. They want to go camping with Miranda Brandt's stepfather. He told them that he would only go when he had permission from his parents and a chaperone from the school. Rachel was shocked and showed it. What? The man who camped with 6 kids from that school? Is it reasonable? He's not exactly a role model, is he? Now it was Noah's turn to be shocked. What exactly do you mean? Rachel didn't notice the sudden coldness in her boss's voice and continued, well, he's divorced because he cheated. He turns Miranda against her mother and forces her to sleep in his house. What are his ideas? Stop. Noah spoke in a soft, but very controlled and authoritative voice and continued. You couldn't be further from the truth than you are right now. I take it Mr. Paulson never told you why he and Mrs. Brandt got divorced, did he? Rachel immediately realized that she had crossed the line and would be severely reprimanded, but she only nodded affirmatively. Let me enlighten you, but if I hear that something comes back to me through the grapevine from what I tell you, I will make your life very miserable. Do you understand? Rachel wanted to nod again, but Noah's voice wavered, yes or no. Yes, Mrs. Dawn, she said in a low voice, and suddenly understood why Noah Dawn had to become the next headmaster of this school. Okay, come with me. I don't want to be disturbed. Returning to Noah's office, she motioned for Rachel to sit down and asked, have you ever bothered to read Miranda Brandt's file? Surprised by the question, Rachel replied, yes, of course. You don't even have to ask. Then have you noticed that until the last 2 years, all of Miranda's school activities were spent in the company of Mr. Paulson and not her mother? No, I didn't notice it. I thought so. Mr. Paulson was the one who raised the girl, was her support and support. After a divorce and a stubborn judge ruling against Mr. Paulson as the girl's overseer, her world fell apart. But he cheated, is that logical? For Pete's sake, who the hell let you know that Mr. Paulson was cheating on his wife? When I asked him why they divorced, he said there was a marital accident and said nothing about it. So I assumed, Rachel stuttered. You were wrong. And it's none of your business why they got divorced. I know firsthand why Mr. Paulson divorced Mrs. Brandt, and that should be enough. Noah said in a cold voice, don't underestimate Mr. Paulson. He is very smart and a very good mentor, as you can tell by the results of the children in your class that he teaches. Rachel was a little tired from all the information she had to absorb. Is he teaching these kids? I saw them getting into his car, and it looked like they were having fun, not going to do their homework. Yes, he helps them with math and physics, and as you can see, he gets results. They also go on this journey. Now we only need an accompanying person. It may be in everyone's interest that you should be the chaperone. Rachel didn't like the idea at all, but she knew she had no choice if she still wanted to make a career at this school. She weakly tried to get out of it. She looked down at her shoes and blushed slightly as she admitted, first of all, I know next to nothing about camping. Secondly, he probably doesn't want me with him. I'm pretty sure this man already hates me. Rachel's blush deepened as she almost whispered, I was barely polite to him, and he had to insist on information about Miranda, and you just told me he's her role model. You know about my sexual preferences. If he had been a woman, my hunting season for him would have been open long ago. I suggest you go to his house. I know that they are preparing for a trip, and you, as a representative of the school, will want to take part in it. Here is the address. In awe, Rachel looked at the address and was surprised to notice that she lived nearby. The address was at the dead end of a dirt road where an off-road bike path began. She never knew there was a house there. Half an hour later, she rang the doorbell very nervously. Steve opened the door and Rachel stuttered, I've been appointed as the school representative for the camping trip. Steve grinned and said, Miss Dawn can be quite persistent if she wants something, don't you think? And now you're stuck with me. Maybe we can make a truce. Rachel looked at him and thought, you don't know the half of it. Steve simply continued, I think we ended up on the wrong end. Let's start again. Good afternoon, I'm Steve Powelson, Miranda's guardian. Call me Steve. And you? Steve watched as the beautiful fair-skinned redhead blushed so hard her freckles almost disappeared as she stuttered, I'm Rachel Garland, Miranda's mentor. I must confess that you are right about Mrs. Dawn and that I have never slept in a tent. If you don't want me to go with you, I understand. This was her last attempt to get away from it all. Doesn't matter. I will run the camp. You just need to follow me. Just follow me. By the way, are you afraid of heights? You may have to climb, but I won't ask you to do that, if it bothers you. They walked through the house. Rachel noticed several photos of a man hanging by his fingertips on a ledge. She looked at them and asked, "What is this man doing? He's angry." Steve laughed out loud. It was a warm, heartfelt laugh. He replied, "Yes, I'm crazy. This is my sport. I climb rocks with my bare hands and wear special shoes. That's what we're going to do on the trip, among other things." Now Rachel understood what calloused hands were. She looked again and saw Steve's muscles bulge with the effort, and the image of him lying on top of her in the bed flashed hotly in her mind. They arrived at the workshop and Steve whispered in her ear, "I'm going to play a little trick on you to break the ice. I apologize in advance. Guys, we have an inspection coming up, so behave yourself." The 6 children turned around, happily greeted Rachel, and continued. "Climbing? Here?" Rachel exclaimed in confusion. Steve built a small climbing wall in the back of the workshop. Its height was about 20 feet, although the pulleys through which the ropes passed made it impossible to climb higher than 17 feet. There were handles of different colors on the wall. Their shape was also different. Rachel sat down on a small stool and watched the children having a very good time. She was just starting to get hungry when Steve shouted, "Okay, everyone, let's take off our climbing gear. Wash your hands, dinner is ready." He turned to Rachel and said, smiling, "I think it's time for dinner for you too. Would you like to eat with us?" One of the kids shouted, "Steve, what are we having for dinner?" "Quiche, onion and vegetable, and with bacon. Oh, and one with chicken, bean sprouts, fresh ginger, and bell pepper." "Oh, yum, yum, yum. Miss Garland, you'd better eat here. This is amazing." Rachel relented. In the depths of her soul, she was tormented by the feeling that she was lost and could not do anything about it. She was amazed by the dinner Steve prepared, complete, healthy, and tasty. Steve asked the kids questions. "We have tents that can accommodate 3 people with some luggage. How many tents do we need?" "3," was the immediate response from one of the girls. "Why?" Steve asked. One for the 3 girls, one for the boys, and one for you and Miss Garland." The girl froze a little, blushed, and said, "Sorry, 4. You and Miss Garland are not sleeping in the same tent." Okay, when working with people, always consider social norms. 4 and an awning. Rachel chimed in, "Excuse me, but what is a tent?" One of the boys chuckled, and Steve stopped it immediately. "I laughed when you put your climbing harness on the wrong way. I apologize to Miss Garland, young man." After dinner, Steve said goodbye to Rachel, apologizing that he needed to take the kids home. Rachel walked home confused. This man undoubtedly had a good influence on children. He talked about discipline while hiking and especially while climbing. He made it clear that he was the leader and responsible for everyone, including Rachel. She still didn't like Steve, but she was becoming more and more physically attracted to him. When she saw him showing the kids how to climb the route, he was wearing a sleeveless t-shirt and climbing shorts. She noticed his muscles, his stamina. She decided to take some sexy climbing clothes with her. Finally, the children's minibus was loaded with camping equipment and luggage. Rachel had to follow them in her car, silently rejoicing that he does not depend on Steve for transport and can go home at any time if he wants. 3 hours later, they arrived at the place Steve had chosen for camp. It was at the entrance to a small ravine at a bend in the stream. The area was fairly flat, about 8 or 9 feet above a small patch of grass that was just above the water level and ended at a gravel beach. The stream formed a small transparent pond, which was regularly updated due to the overflow of the stream. Steve told the kids to set up camp on higher ground. He carefully explained to everyone that thunderstorms were expected upstream and could quickly turn the creek into a raging torrent. This caused a major clash between Rachel and Steve. Rachel didn't like taking instructions from blue-collar people, no matter how smart they were. She told Steve in front of the children that she was not his student and would do as she saw fit. Steve almost exploded, counted to 100 and back, and took out his camera. He handed the camera to Callum, a shy 18-year-old nerd with an innate knowledge of all things electronics. Steve said out loud to Callum, "Point the camera at Miss Rachel and me and start recording." Steve approached Rachel and in a very formal and commanding voice, under the gaze of 6 students, said, "During the preparation for this trip, we established that I am responsible for the camp and the safety of the participants on this trip. Accordingly, I decide how things should happen to ensure safety. You may pitch your tent in this meadow only if you release me from responsibility for your personal safety. Otherwise, we pack everything up, go home, and I will have a cordial conversation with the director. So what will your actions be?" Rachel felt backed into a corner, but stubbornly refused to follow Steve's instructions or absolve him of his responsibility for her. Finally, Steve said, "Sorry guys, pack everything back on the bus. We are coming home." The kids grumbled, and it dawned on Rachel that Steve was fully prepared to follow through on his threat. And while she might win the battle, she would definitely lose the war. She exclaimed in despair, "Okay, do it your way. You are not, I repeat, not responsible for my safety, so I pitch my tent on the grass next to the stream." Satisfied, Steve replied, "No, I would prefer that you pitch a tent here with the others, but since you cannot accept my leadership and want to take more risks than is wise, do what you want." Steve and the kids' tents were soon pitched and ready for the night. The tent was stretched between the trees, and soon Steve was preparing dinner. The children helped where they could, collecting firewood and peeling vegetables. Steve wrapped the potatoes in foil with the herbs and butter and put them on the fire. Dinner was good, and the rest of the evening was lively. Steve told the kids what he had in store for them. On Friday, they will hike to a nearby bird observation post, where a ranger will explain about the nature reserve. Steve has built several wildlife cameras. He will install them in and around the camp to help make the documentary, and later, when they return home, will donate them to the forestry department. Saturday morning will be used for bouldering and rock climbing, followed by swimming in the afternoon. Sunday morning is another hike, albeit a short one, and after lunch the camp will be cleared up for Monday. Rachel heard all this in awe. She might have known if she had read Steve's email, but she wasn't interested then. The only thing she read was the list of what she needed to bring. Rachel had to admit that the hike was enjoyable. The warm weather, winding paths, beautiful views, and the explanations of the ranger, who introduced herself as Patricia Sands, were, as Steve promised, very interesting. She also learned that this pleasant woman was a good friend of Steve's and a fellow bird watcher. It was she who negotiated the permit for the camp, promising the chief 5 video traps for wildlife. Patricia also told Rachel that she was coming over in the evening to learn how to set traps, since Steve, being Steve, had designed them completely differently than the standard traps available in stores and would stay for dinner. Rachel decided to use the evening to find out about Steve. That evening, Steve explained to Tricky, as he called her, that the traps could be viewed remotely so as not to disturb the surrounding area except to change the batteries. Thus, the likelihood of detecting more secretive animals increases significantly. They set 2 traps in the camp and the rest around. When they finished, Steve led the children to the place where they would climb tomorrow. The women stayed, enjoying the peace and quiet. Rachel began carefully, "I know Steve as Miranda's guardian. We met at school. How did you meet Steve?" Bird Watching Club Orderly was on an excursion at the forestry department, and I was the guide. Steve, like me, was recently divorced, and we started talking about it. We liked each other and became friends. He got me interested in rock climbing. I'll help you too with the kids tomorrow. Is he good at climbing? Hell yes. Some professional climbers have even used it to scout possible routes. He conquered several new routes in Idaho. He could be a successful professional climber, but he prefers his job. Either way, he's a good friend of mine now. Rachel probed a little more. I only know him as Miranda's guardian, so I don't know him well. What kind of person is he? Patricia smiled inwardly and thought, just as Steve predicted, she can't find an angle on him. She gathered her thoughts, wondering what to tell the woman and what not. He is quite shy, caring, gentle, and very smart. Most people underestimate him because he always keeps his cards close to his chest. Steve adores Miranda, even though she is not his biological daughter. What's funny is that people confuse his gentleness and shyness with weakness and think that he can be suppressed. Oh, and he's in great shape, very durable and physically controlled. She giggled as she said this. Rachel said irritably, "What do you mean by the confusion of softness and weakness?" She doesn't like him, that's for sure. She's used to manipulating people, and that doesn't work with Steve, thought Patricia. She hesitated to answer. It's difficult to anger him, and even more difficult to piss him off. Because he refuses to get angry, it's easy to think that he can be intimidated. There were a few people who learned about it firsthand. Is this the reason his wife divorced him? Here it is. You still can't believe Steve is taking care of someone else's child, even though he divorced Catherine, and you can't wait to find out why. Patricia snorted and replied, she didn't divorce Steve. It was the other way around. But that's a completely different story, and it's not for me to tell. After a pause, Patricia added, I'm going to go get some firewood. Would you like to join me? Necessary. I'm still a little tired from this morning, and I'm not used to this kind of life. Why am I not surprised? Thought Patricia. Okay, rest, she answered somewhat venomously and went into the forest. Rachel didn't like this at all. The woman's giggle at the mention of stamina and control made her almost certain that they were more than just friends. She decided to be straightforward and beat the answers out of this impudent woman when she returned. Patricia returned with her hands full of firewood, threw them down, and left again. When she returned the second time, she was dragging a tree trunk behind her. As she straightened up and wiped the sweat from her brow, Rachel pounced. You said you were friends. With privileges, I suppose. I noticed your satisfied face. Hell yes. Steve is an amazing lover, Patricia responded without any trepidation. When we meet and feel itchy, we go to the hotel and scratch it. We both have very different lives and responsibilities, and we want to keep it that way. Are you saying he's good in bed? Without any hesitation, Patricia replied, he is like that. He can do this for a very long time, and it drives you crazy. Rachel tried to digest this information and wanted to ask more, but she was interrupted by Steve, who returned to the camp with the children. She still didn't know what he did for a living. I only realized that it is not tied to standard working hours, and she developed a slight obsession with finding out the reason for his divorce and his relationship with Miranda. It was obvious that this went beyond simple guardianship. Rachel didn't sleep well. She was not used to sleeping on the ground with a thin mattress just for insulation. It did nothing to soften it from the hard ground. Grumbling, she crawled out of her tent only to find that everyone was already up and doing business. Patricia was already there, sorting the climbing gear needed for that morning. She smiled at Rachel and asked, Good morning, sleepyhead. Did you sleep well? Rachel wasn't a morning person and didn't respond. Steve's cheerfulness didn't help either until he asked with a wry smile on his face, Coffee? Oh, and Tricky brought breakfast. Croissants, Danish pastries, and fresh sourdough bread. Better have a snack, you'll need energy this morning. When they arrived at the site where they were going to climb, the first thing Steve did was set up one of the video traps to record everyone who would be climbing. When he was finished, He took off his clothes, except for a pair of shorts and climbing shoes. He began to climb, and Rachel realized that Patricia had not exaggerated Steve's physical fitness. While climbing to the top of the cliff, Rachel had a good view of Steve's body, and every muscle was visible, although he seemed to do it effortlessly. When he was at the top of the cliff, Steve dropped the rope to raise the tripod for the pulley. Steve went downstairs again, and Patricia went up first. She was supposed to help those who climbed to the top. Once everything was installed and secured properly, the fun began. Rachel enjoyed it. It all started when Steve checked her security system. She finally felt his strong and calloused hands as he fastened the buckles properly. She snuggled up to him and smelled him. He smelled so good. No perfume or aftershave, but it smelled like excitement, fresh sweat, and effort. An intoxicating combination for the already horny Rachel. She climbed up with difficulty, but squealed with delight as she descended down the rope into the gorge. Steve enjoyed the silence that evening. The kids swam in the pond. Patricia went off to set 3 of the 5 wildlife traps and left 2 to record the camp for a documentary. Steve was lying on his stomach, sunbathing and rereading a book by one of his favorite science fiction writers, when he felt a cold splash on his back. He looked up to see Rachel smiling with a bottle of sunscreen. "Let me anoint your back, and you can anoint mine. I already gave the children a bottle so they can handle it themselves." Without asking, she began to apply the cream to Steve's back. When her hands touched his shoulders, she felt a shiver run down her spine. He seemed very pleasant to the touch. Hard, sinewy muscle under tan skin, but Steve turned his head and said, "There's no need for that. I can do it myself." Rachel snorted, "Perhaps, but I can't reach my back, and I don't want kids to do that. I was hoping you would do me a favor." "No problem, but I myself am taking care of my back." 10 minutes later, Rachel was lying on a towel on her inflatable mat while Steve rubbed her back. She was quite disappointed. Since the morning she had been lusting after this man, and her attempt to rub his back was the first attempt to get him into her bed, and he rejected her. This was unusual for her. Anyway, the bright side was that he was rubbing her back and his hands were beautiful. And at the end of the day, they all heard thunder in the distance. Steve began giving instructions on how to prepare the children and the camp for bad weather. He walked up to Rachel and said, "If you still want to move your tent, now is the time. Soon it will rain in buckets, and I'm afraid that your meadow will be flooded." Rachel, being stubborn, refused to do this. They ate quickly and quietly under the canopy as the first drops of rain began to fall. Quickly and silently, Steve, with the help of the children, removed everything, set the remaining traps, and when the wind got stronger and it became uncomfortable to be outside, they all went to their tents. Rachel listened to the rain. Her thoughts returned to the day, and she felt Steve's hands on her back again. Suddenly, she felt something cold seeping into her sleeping bag. She released one hand and touched the ground. She was wet. Rachel sat down. Water leaked through the zipper. The bedding felt like a water mattress. "Damn, damn, damn. My tent is leaking," she thought as she crawled out of her sleeping bag. Now everything was wet. Cursing, she put on wet trousers, a sweater, put on her boots, and opened the zipper of the tent. Immediately, water rushed inside, instantly soaking her. "That's all. I'm sick of it. I'll go home and sleep in my bed after a hot bath." She barely had time to grab her bag containing her keys, car keys, and wallet. Outside the tent, she stood in 5 inches of a rushing stream that was quickly rising, zipped the tent shut again, and walked toward higher ground. Her boots and pants were wet. She walked straight to her car, which was parked at the end of the road, got in and drove away. Steve stayed awake most of the night, listening to the howling of the storm and the rain pattering on the tent. He counted how many seconds passed between the flash of lightning and the clap of thunder. Because of the noise of the storm, he did not notice Rachel's departure at all. Just before dawn, the storm subsided and Steve began checking on the others once again. Suddenly, he became aware of the sound of a stream. He raged. Steve quickly went to check the tents when he saw a piece of wood rushing menacingly down the stream towards Rachel's flooded and collapsed tent. Screaming, he woke up the children and told them to pack their things. Having done this, he quickly grabbed a rope from the pile, tied it to a tree, and jumped into the cold stream. She appeared to still be in the tent, possibly unconscious. In front of 6 children, he made his way through the stormy water. As he tried to find the entrance, a thick tree branch hit him in the ribs and threatened to pull him down. Steve screamed in pain, but somehow held on to the rope and tent. The branch turned slightly and flowed downstream without hitting Steve. He tied the tent to a rope and found the entrance. Empty, he started to panic a little. He climbed back onto land and asked the children to help with the search. A few minutes later, Miranda returned and told Steve that Rachel's car was missing. Now Steve had to sit down. "Children, take your bags. We are returning home. I think I need to see a doctor. So just pack your things, and I'll ask Tricky to clean up this mess. Please hurry," he shouted. The children also slept poorly, a little dazed from fatigue and the surprise of returning home so early. They got into the car. Steve tried not to wobble as he walked to the car. When he got behind the wheel, he felt dizzy. He shook himself and started the car. 3 hours later, Steve dropped off the first 4 kids with no problem. Their parents were glad to see them home safely after bad weather and news of flash floods. Steve was getting worse and decided to take Miranda with him to the hospital after he passed the last charge. He arrived at the address feeling weak. The girl's mother came up to thank him and looked at him carefully. His face was pale and he was covered in sweat. She asked worriedly, "Are you okay? I'm a nurse and my husband is a doctor." Steve answered weakly, "I don't think so," and fell onto the steering wheel. Miranda screamed, "Daddy, Dad!" She turned and said, "He already wanted to see a doctor. Help him, please." Meanwhile, the girl called her father, who came running. After one look, he dialed 911 and said into the phone, "I need an ambulance and shock team. I have a man here who is threatening to go into shock." He gave his name and address. Steve barely understood what was happening. He told Steve, "I need to put you on the ground and lay you on your back. It won't be pleasant. Are you ready?" His parents, with the help of the girls, carefully laid him on a blanket on the ground and raised his legs. The doctors saw the damage caused by the tree. He cursed quietly, "I hope the damn ambulance gets here on time." Carefully, he began to palpate the wound and its surroundings. He felt the ribs bend and the sharp ends break through the skin. Finally, he heard the ambulance and shock team sirens breaking through the morning silence. Carefully, Steve was moved onto a stretcher and started on in Roman 4 to replace the lost fluid with plasma. Miranda was helped up into the ambulance, and the ambulance drove off, screaming and blinking, to the hospital. When they arrived, Steve was moved to the shock room and Miranda was ushered into the waiting room. Steve's phone was in her hand. She didn't want to be alone, and the only person she could think of was her mother. She tried to unlock the phone and did it on the first try. Her birthday. She pressed the speed dial button, and after a minute or two, she heard a sleepy voice say, "Steve?" "Mom," she said in a quiet voice. Mama, Steve has an accident, and he's in the hospital, and it's serious." She started crying. "Where are you?" she heard her mother ask. "At the general." "I'll be there in 45 minutes. Catherine turned to her casual lover and rudely woke him up. "Sorry, you have to go. My ex needs help." The man grumbled. "What? Are you kicking me out because of your ex? He's your ex. Let him rot wherever he is." "Get out. This is my ex, and I still love him very much. Now move." 15 minutes later, 2 wide, parallel black stripes adorned Catherine's driveway. Half an hour later, having broken almost every traffic law, she parked the car, tires squealing, and ran inside. Gasping, she ran to where Miranda was waiting. The girl nervously walked around the room. She saw her mother and began to cry again, sobbing. He was operated on, and they don't tell me anything anymore. Steve's phone vibrated, and Catherine looked at him and asked, "Do you know Tricky?" Miranda nodded and took the phone. "Hi, Patricia. This is Miranda. Dad is unavailable." Catherine flinched when Miranda called Steve Daddy, and the regret and remorse came flooding back. She wanted to cry, but she had to stay strong. She heard Miranda explain what happened at the camp. "Dad woke us up when the weather got worse and started looking for Miss Garland. Her tent was almost washed away by the flood. When Dad checked, she wasn't there. Then I discovered that her car was also missing. Dad said we were going home because he needed a doctor. When we were at the last address, he became so ill that they had to call a shock team. Dad is now being operated on in the shock room of the hospital." "General," Miranda blurted out. Patricia explained that she wanted to collect the remaining 2 video traps and discovered that the camp was empty. She called to see if everything was okay. She promised to review the footage and save it as it might be needed, and promised to take care of the camp tomorrow. Catherine was looking for her phone and remembered that in her haste to get to the hospital, she left it on the nightstand. She used Steve's phone to call Noah Dawn. She told her what Miranda told Steve's friend. Noah told her that she would not expect Miranda at school while Steve was in danger, and that she would inform her father that Catherine was unavailable right now. She finished softly, "Catherine, I know you still love him, but he still loves you too. This is your chance. Take action." Noah ended the call, leaving Catherine confused. Catherine suddenly felt confused. She thought, "Does she know Robert Dawn Sr.? Damn, she's the younger one's sister. How did I not think of it before? That's why she's so knowledgeable. I know they love each other, but she said Steve still loves me." She shook herself and turned to Miranda, saying, "He can handle it. Steve is very stubborn, and this hospital has a very good reputation." The wait was long, very long. Periodically, someone would come and check on them, but no one would bring any news, good or bad. Finally, at the beginning of the evening, Dr. Bays Samuelson came out and introduced herself. "The situation is under control. We finally found the damaged vein and also discovered the ruptured diaphragm that was causing the problem. Fortunately, there wasn't an artery nearby. Otherwise, he would have been dead within minutes. We had to fix it, and until that was done, we didn't want to give false hope. He's not out of danger yet. He also has several other problems, such as several broken ribs and a badly bruised pelvic bone. I think it was dislocated for a moment before it snapped back into place. But I think you can safely go home and rest. We will call you if there is news. He is currently in an induced coma." Catherine asked, "Can we see him?" Dr. Samuelson responded softly, "You can, but I wouldn't recommend it. This is not a very pleasant sight. His eyes are taped shut. There are tubes sticking out everywhere, and the bandages don't hide much. Tomorrow will be better. By then we will know more about his condition. I will add that a person with less mental or physical condition would be in the morgue now, and not in our intensive care unit." Patricia was cleaning up the remains of the camp. She downloaded footage from the camera traps and checked to see if there was anything interesting. She was surprised. Steve even built in a microphone so there was both picture and sound. For now, she decided to leave them in place. Suddenly, she heard a car approaching. When she looked, she saw Rachel Garland coming out and heading towards the camp. Patricia blocked her way, saying, "You have courage. How dare you? Why did you leave without telling Steve?" "Where is everyone?" Rachel asked, taken aback by the anger in Patricia's voice. "What do you think? Perhaps at home." "Oh, good. I can go home." "And Steve is in the hospital. It's your fault, you stupid bitch." Rachel blushed. "Don't talk to me like that. You have no right," she said in a loud voice. "You left without telling him. That's why my friend is in the hospital. That gives me all the rights, you lazy creature." "I warned him. It's his own stupidity," Rachel lied. "It was her word against Steve's, and he was a blue-collar guy, and she had her father's money and influence. Let's see." Now get out of my sight before I throw you into the water behind your tent." Rachel quickly retreated to her car and drove home, glad to be spared from cleaning up the camp and to have some free time. She drove quickly and returned home by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I opened the door and immediately saw the blinking light on the answering machine. She thought out loud, "I'm not at home, I'm still at the camp, so I can't answer." Meanwhile, Miranda was at the hospital talking to Noah and the school principal. Steve was still in a coma, but out of immediate danger. Noah was already angry, but became furious when Patricia arrived and told her what happened that morning. She also said she reviewed the footage and was certain Ms. Garland walked straight towards her car without stopping. She certainly didn't warn anyone about her departure that night. The director intervened, saying, "Noah, you're too involved. It became personal for you. I know that you and Mr. Paulson are good friends. I'll take care of this matter. Miss Garland has many questions to answer." He turned to Catherine and Patricia. "We need someone to look after his interests now that Mr. Paulson cannot do it himself. Since he was volunteering at the school at the time of the incident, we will be contacting our insurance company regarding this matter." Patricia and Catherine looked at each other. Patricia asked Miranda if the women could talk in private. When the girl was out of earshot, she said to Catherine, "Can you handle it? There are 2 reasons why you should do this." Catherine looked blankly at the other woman. "What do you mean? You're his young woman." "No," Patricia answered with emphasis. "I am a very good friend with whom I sometimes have privileges. But it's your daughter and his, stepdaughter. He loves you both very much. This is a great chance to establish a good relationship with him, and you look like you really want it." I don't know what to say. Is it that obvious? Yes. Now get down to business and tell the director that you will handle all of Steve's affairs. I will help if necessary." Catherine looked at the director and said emphatically, "I will handle all of Steve's affairs." She took a card out of her purse and wrote her personal phone number on the back. The director left with Noah, and Catherine began looking for a nurse or doctor. When she found Dr. Bart Samuelson, he had good news. Steve was out of danger and was transferred from intensive care to the intensive care unit. Now he just needs to recover and undergo rehabilitation. He also told them that they might see Steve, but it still wouldn't be a pretty sight. Catherine, Miranda, and Patricia walked through the maze of hospital corridors until they reached the intensive care unit where Steve now resided. Steve was lying on his back, half covered with a blanket. His torso was covered in bandages, some of which had a tube sticking out of them. He was breathing slowly, looked pale and very tired. All 3 women burst into tears, and Patricia said through clenched teeth, "That lazy witch will pay for this." Rachel walked into her classroom. She looked at the children. Everyone had very serious faces, especially those who were on a hike. Before she could place her briefcase on the table, the first question was directed at her. "Miss Garland, where were you on Sunday morning?" "What do you have in mind? Why are you asking?" "I told Mr. Paulson that I had urgent and personal matters to attend to and would be back on Monday." "If so, can you explain why Mr. Paulson tried to rescue you from the flooded tent?" Before Rachel could come up with an acceptable response, someone said quite loudly, "Afraid of some water? Deserter." Rachel almost exploded and angrily screamed, "Who said that?" Half the kids in the class stood up, looking back with the same fury. The door opened, Noah came in, looked around, and took control of the situation. "Looks like I'm just in time. By the way, Miss Garland, the director wants to talk to you. I'm here to take your class." "Why does the director want to talk to me?" Noah responded with barely restrained hostility. "As if you don't know yourself, but I'm sure they'll tell you everything." Rachel left the classroom without saying a word. Noah looked at the children and, when they calmed down, told them that Miranda's stepfather was not in immediate danger, but was still very sick. A sigh of relief flowed through the class. All the children knew Steve in one way or another and loved him very much. Rachel headed towards the administration office. When she entered, she was greeted by the principal, the head of human resources, and the school's legal counsel. The director pointed to a chair and offered to sit down. "Can you explain why you left the camp on Sunday and only now showed up at school?" The HR manager asked her as Rachel sat down. Rachel sat up straight, crossed her legs, and decided to go on the attack, replying, "Just before I left, I told Mr. Paulson that I needed to return home to attend to urgent and personal matters. He agreed. What is the problem?" "Shortly before you left the camp, you didn't go straight to the car with your things and drive away?" asked the lawyer. "No, Mr. Paulson told me to leave." The director cleared his throat loudly. "So when Mr. Paulson tried to rescue you from the tent that was threatening to be swept away by the torrential flood, he forgot that you were gone. How convenient." He left the implied accusation hanging in the air. There was dead silence. The director spoke again, but this time his voice was soft, but every word was spoken with cold and calculating precision. "Garland, you have one chance, and one chance only, to tell us exactly what happened. If you continue to lie, we will hold you responsible for what happened to Mr. Paulson and will act accordingly." Rachel angrily replied, "What? Do you dare call me a liar? Do you know who my father is?" The lawyer coldly replied, "It doesn't matter who your father is or who he is. We give you the opportunity to clarify your side of this vexing issue. The fact is that you, as a representative of this school, abandoned the children entrusted to you and, through your negligence, endangered the life of a volunteer." Rachel finally realized that this conversation was not going in her favor. She decided to bluff. "I'm tired of this. I see where this conversation is going, and I won't tolerate it. I'll go. You will hear from my father's lawyers." As Rachel walked out the door, the HR director asked the lawyer, "Did we forget to mention that her father already knows everything and has a recording of her leaving the camp?" The lawyer just grinned and said, "I foresaw this reaction. Her father asked me to take care of his daughter if we kept her on our staff. I have already dealt with Mr. Garland. I trust him, so I agreed." Meanwhile, Catherine woke up in the hospital chair, slowly, painfully, and disoriented. Her body was stiff and painful. She looked back and saw a doctor and nurse examining Steve. "How is he?" she wheezed. The nurse nudged the doctor, who was focused on the examination. The doctor grumbled, "I can tell you, but if you wait another 10 minutes, I can give you more accurate information." Catherine left the room to find herself a cup of coffee and something to eat. When she returned, the doctor was just putting away his stethoscope and went to wash his hands. He turned, looked at his patient, and said, "He is out of danger. Note that he has not yet come out of critical condition. He faces a long recovery process, and these operations, although necessary, also did not bring him any benefit. I adjusted his medications so he would wake up within the next 2 hours. I take it you'll be here?" "Yes, doctor. You can count on it." Later that morning, Rachel walked into her father's office. Robert Garland motioned for her to sit in a chair, his eyes glued to the computer screens. When he finished, he picked up the phone and told the secretary, "Don't bother me until I say otherwise." He looked at his daughter. "You haven't been visiting for a long time, my daughter. You might think that you forgot the old man in his office." "Dad, that's not true," Rachel said in an annoyed voice. "Do you remember the last time you visited me?" "Dad, I was busy. I have a lot to do," she exclaimed irritably. "Watch your tone, young lady. I'm still your father." This was different from Rachel's rare visits with her father, and she was suddenly speechless. "I can only assume that you only come to me when trouble is on the horizon." Robert raised his hand to stop her attempt to interrupt him. "But that's not on the horizon right now. You're already up to your neck in problems." "I'm not in trouble," Rachel almost screamed. "Oh, just like in problems. And from now on you will solve your problems yourself. I'm shocked by your behavior last weekend." "I didn't do anything wrong. I told them I was going home." "This is a blatant lie, and we both know it. You went straight to your car and drove away." "And what? My word is against this worker's word. Who will they believe? The angry woman shouted to her father. Rachel paused before continuing her tirade and looked at her father's face. She stopped and realized that something was quickly becoming very problematic for her. For several minutes, except for the ticking of the large clock, there was absolute silence in the office. "I see," Robert almost whispered. "May I remind you that before I got lucky and became a successful merchant, I was one of these workers, just a modest mechanic in your eyes. Now I understand that I made a terrible mistake by letting your aunt raise you. She put some very, very wrong ideas in your head and sent you to the wrong schools. It's my fault that I didn't pay enough attention, and now I have to pay for it." Rachel dreaded those words. She felt that this did not bode well. She did not dare interrupt her father. The only other time she'd seen this happen was when half the village lost their jobs after the home of an immigrant family who had started a construction company and outbid local competitors was set on fire. Robert Garland learned about what had happened. He closed his factory, saying he didn't want to hire racists, and now his anger was directed at her. "It's time for you to take responsibility for your actions or inactions. I spoke with the school principal, and now he agrees to keep you as a teacher. On probation, mind you. He will tell you all the details. For my part, I will direct your funds to the school fund to support parents who cannot afford to pay all school expenses. This means that now you will only have your salary. I will also reimburse the school and Mr. Pame Paulson for any expenses associated with your absence last weekend. The last thing I will do is send your aunt back to Europe with a small allowance so that she can no longer be a bad influence on you. She abused my trust and stayed here too long. And you, my dear, will face a much, much more difficult life. The lives of those people you look at so condescendingly. I wish you wisdom and strength. Now get out of my sight." A few days later, Steve slowly regained consciousness. The first sign that something was wrong was a throbbing headache, followed by a dull, aching pain in the chest and a feeling of being tied down. With difficulty, he opened his eyes. His eyelids seemed to be stuck together. When he finally opened his eyes and was able to concentrate, he simply looked around. "I'm in the hospital. How did I end up here?" He then noticed Catherine dozing on a chair. He tried to say her name, but his mouth was dry. It sounded like a frog with a sore throat. Catherine jumped up from her chair. "Steve, you're awake," she screamed. "Wait, I'll call the nurse," and pressed the button. The nurse came in, said, "1 minute, please," and left again. A minute or two later, she returned with a glass of water, followed by Dr. Samuelson. He looked at Steve and said, "I'm not going to ask how you feel. I can guess. Now that you're awake, I'll loosen the straps. They were needed to prevent you from damaging our work. Afterwards, the nurse will moisten your dry throat so you can speak a little better." 10 minutes later, Steve was able to croak out, "What happened? Why is Catherine here? Is there something wrong with Miranda too?" Dr. Samuelson interrupted him. The last thing he wanted was for his patient to worry more than he already was. "You arrived here on the verge of shock. You have a lot of bruises and 2 broken ribs. Fortunately, they did not damage the lung. After that, we kept you in a coma for several days so that you would come to your senses. What happened, I think the ladies will tell you better than me. All is clear." Steve nodded in agreement. Meanwhile, Catherine called her daughter and Patricia. After Dr. Samuelson left, Steve asked, "Catherine, why are you here? Don't have a job?" Catherine answered easily, but with a quiver in her throat, because she was afraid of Steve's possible reluctance to let her take care of him. "Noah, through Mr. Donna, gave me a task more important than counting numbers, namely, taking care of you. That's why I'm here to take care of you." Steve muttered and thought, "Why do I feel like I'm being set up? At the same time, it's not so bad. Better my ex-wife than some fat nurse trying to dominate me." Not wanting to show his joy, he asked, "We are divorced. You found another man. Why on earth would you want to take care of me?" Ekaterina, I was waiting for this question. 7 years of marriage had taught her the way he thought, and she had an answer ready. She decided that being completely honest with him was the only way to deal with this situation. Steve could spot any trick a mile away. She replied, "There are two equally important reasons. I heard Miranda call you daddy on the phone with Patricia, and Miranda really needs a father. I've seen up close what happens when you're not in her life." She took a deep breath, lowered her eyes, and almost whispered, "You cared about Miranda even after the judge kicked you out of her life. It was not my will. I never asked for this. Stupid judge." Catherine paused for a moment to gather her courage and said even more quietly, "I was the stupidest bitch on any side of this planet to treat you the way I did, and I regret it every day. I am not whole and never have been since you properly divorced me. I still love you with all my heart and would take any chance to try again. I won't impose myself, but I will do my best." Steve was stunned by Catherine's confession. He thought she had moved on with her life and tolerated him because of his positive influence on Miranda. But she did not continue with her life and simply tolerated him. Now what? Should I let her into my life? Even if it's only for a short time, do I need care? Can I trust her? If one way or another it doesn't work out and we end up hating each other, what will happen to Miranda? He replied carefully, "Don't be disappointed that I don't jump out of bed with enthusiasm. I just woke up and I already see serious problems on the way." Catherine sighed internally with relief. Steve didn't reject the idea out of hand. She looked into his eyes. "Let me take care of you. It's the least I can do. You have already done so much for me." Steve raised one eyebrow. She quickly continued, "Taking care of Miranda, saving her from that pimp, and putting her on the right path. I blame myself once again for being so stupid as to break our wedding vows. I'm so sorry for the pain I caused you, and for what? Just for fun. It was hardly pleasant and not worth it at all. Please let me take care of you during this time." Steve softened. Catherine was sincere. He was sure of it. "Okay," he muttered, "just this once." Surprised that Steve relented so quickly, she asked, "I think when you get out of the hospital, you will want to stay in your home. Do you have a place for me to stay for this time?" Steve thought for a moment and said, "Sure. Perhaps this is for the best. Miranda may be involved too. I think she needs it. Ask Miranda to show you everything." Catherine looked at her watch and told Steve, "Okay, Miranda will be here with Patricia soon. I'll go home, clean myself up, and pack my things. I'll be back soon and take Miranda with me to your house, if that's okay. Where does she sleep, if I may ask?" "In the workshop, there is a small living space that she appropriated. She is very happy there. I sleep on the second floor in a room with a balcony. Miranda will show you everything." Catherine went to the door. Suddenly, she came back, walked over to the bed, and kissed Steve tenderly on the lips, saying, "I love you, I really do, and it was a thank you for taking care of Miranda. Our daughter, how she sees it." She quickly left the room, leaving Steve confused. He didn't have much time to think about it because Miranda almost jumped onto his bed before Patricia walked in, quickly saying, "Watch out, girl. Steve is awake, but he is very fragile. Be careful." Recovery was a slow process. After 20 days in the hospital, he was finally released and sent home with a book full of tips and instructions. The nurse was supposed to come once a day to check his wounds, and the physiotherapist was supposed to come the day after tomorrow. One unexpected visitor came to him in the hospital. An elderly man entered his room using a beautifully crafted Malacca cane. He took Steve's hand and said, "May I introduce myself? I am Robert Garland, the disgraceful father of your stepdaughter's mentor." Steve immediately became wary. This was noticed by R. Garland. He couldn't create a diversified trading company without being a very good observer of people's body language. He quickly said, "I came to apologize and see how I can help. But first of all, please accept my apologies for my daughter's behavior. I made a big mistake by asking my daughter-in-law to take care of my children after their mother died." Now I have to correct myself and make very tough adjustments in order to raise them into responsible and sociable people. This won't help you, I know, but I will pay for any damage you suffered during your recovery. What are you doing?" Steve noticed that the man was being brutally honest with himself and began to respect him. "Mr. Garland." "Robert, please." "Robert, first of all, thank you for your concern, and I don't know if I've lost anything." Steve explained what he was doing and saw Robert's eyes light up. He asked, "Do you have any recommendations? Perhaps we will be able to agree on mutually beneficial cooperation." Steve mentioned 4 companies he has worked with. They talked for a bit, and Rachel's dad left Steve on a good note. Steve is home, he finally thought. Not that he could do much. He was weak as a kitten. He lost a lot of blood, the bruises on his ribs were very painful, and he could barely move in the hospital. Catherine set him up in the bedroom. She had put a stool in the bathroom, but now the nurse, a real fortress, was bathing him in bed because she didn't think Steve was fit to shower. Luckily, this was only for the first few days. Catherine moved into the room opposite Steve to see if he would call. It had been a long day, and although Steve had taken a nap, by 9 p.m. he was exhausted. Miranda put him to bed. "Good night, Dad. Sleep well," she said, hugging him tenderly. As Miranda was leaving, Catherine entered. She emphasized again, "Steve, I'm here to take care of you. So if you need anything, absolutely everything, call me." "Great, please." Steve promised. Either way, he didn't think he'd have to keep that promise. Catherine kissed him tenderly on the lips. As she bent over, Steve couldn't help but notice that her blouse was unbuttoned, exposing her breasts, uncontained by her underwear. He smiled internally. She promised and left. She knows I love looking at her like this, and it's still a sight to behold. Then I remembered my dilemma. He thought about kissing her on his lips until he fell asleep. The painkillers helped him sleep well, and he woke up when Catherine woke him at 10 a.m. saying, "Good morning, sleepyhead. How are you feeling?" "Rested," Steve said, "and in pain. I think the painkillers have stopped working. I'll give you some after breakfast. You need to eat something before taking them. What would you want?" Steve grinned. "You cook?" he asked incredulously. He knew firsthand that Catherine couldn't get around in the kitchen. She was a terrible cook, and no matter how hard she tried to improve her skills, the result was more often than not inedible. Catherine smiled at the gentle teasing. In fact, she really liked it. Ever since she asked him for help with Miranda, he had kept his distance, although he was friendly and they communicated often. Miranda needed a lot of talking. She suddenly realized that all this time he had always been polite and friendly. He never reminded her of her stupidity, did not call her offensive names like bitch or slut. Yes, sometimes he was cold and distant when something reminded him of the time of their divorce, but he never said anything derogatory. Catherine looked away for a moment, feeling like she was about to cry. The gesture didn't escape Steve. He asked worriedly, "Catherine, did I say something wrong?" "No," Catherine whispered, "that's the point. Since Miranda made us talk to each other again, you have never spoken ill of me or against me. I'm so ashamed of what I did to you. Katie, please stop beating yourself up. You can't turn back time. I'm not angry anymore. We get along great, and I know you love me, but now I'm damaged and have trust issues. And no, it's not just your fault." Catherine felt a hot wave run through her body. He called me Katie. She thought joyfully and went to prepare breakfast. 2 weeks passed. Steve was now seriously recovering. He could walk downstairs and use his small gym under the supervision of a physical therapist. After consulting with Dr. Tessa Samuelson, Steve decided to gradually wean himself off pain medications. Catherine decided she could use some exercise too, so she joined Steve in the gym when the physiotherapist wasn't showing up. She also enjoyed being able to show off her body in the best possible light without being too obvious. She started with loose sweatpants and t-shirts and gradually moved to leggings or yoga pants with sports tops that showed a little and sometimes a lot of cleavage. When Robert Garland learned of Steve's progress, he visited him again, now for business matters. He invited Steve to become his technical consultant, offering him a more than decent salary with many benefits. It was a part-time job and would leave Steve with plenty of time for his other commitments. It didn't take Steve long to agree. In the hospital and over the following weeks, Steve was given strong painkillers. It turned out that they were also highly addictive, and as soon as Steve was given other, milder painkillers, he began to have serious problems. He was sweating and sneezing. Sometimes he had a fever and had difficulty sleeping. He was tormented by nightmares. More often than not, sometimes several times a night, Catherine would have to hold Steve after a nightmare to calm him down and get him back to sleep. It affected her too. She became tired and had problems concentrating. However, she noticed that as soon as she touched him, he quickly calmed down. After a week, Steve went through the withdrawal phase and was clean, but the nightmares continued. One night, a week later, after 2 nightmares in a row, out of sheer desperation, she crawled into Steve's bed, fully clothed. They slept. Surprisingly, both were fast asleep. Steve woke up, finally feeling a little more rested. He lay motionless, enjoying the moment, when he suddenly became aware of something warm and heavy pressing against his back. Carefully, he tried to turn around when he heard Catherine mumble softly in her sleep. He decided to be patient and wait for her to wake up too. He realized that it was hard for her too, that she never complained and was there whenever he needed her. This realization touched a chord in his mind and made it vibrate. After half an hour, Steve had to give in to the call of nature. He turned around, kissed Catherine softly on the head, climbed out of bed, and went to the bathroom. When he returned, Catherine was already on her feet, sitting upright and looking at him anxiously. She didn't notice the kiss and only woke up when Steve got out of bed. Steve noticed this and came over. He sat down next to her and said, "Thank you for being here and thank you for your concern. I truly cannot express how much this means to me." He softly kissed her forehead and continued, "Now it's my turn to cook breakfast, or rather lunch." For Catherine, it was like a huge boulder had been knocked off her mind. The feeling was so strong that she seemed to float towards the kitchen. She had an epiphany and decided to take the risk as soon as they sat down at the table together. "Steve, can we talk about your nightmares?" Steve looked up with a questioning expression and said, "Yeah, what exactly?" "I've noticed that you've been having nightmares, and every time I'm in the room they go away, at least for a while." Steve nodded and motioned for Catherine to continue. Catherine plucked up her courage. "Last night, in desperation, I crawled into your bed, and you immediately calmed down, and we both got a normal night's rest." Steve nodded and said, "And now you want me to share your bed." Catherine looked at her plate and couldn't say a word. "So," Steve continued, "I think it's worth a try." Catherine looked up and Steve thought her eyes suddenly lit up. "Really?" "Yes, it's true. I think it's worth a try. My thoughts are that it's not for 2 nights, so pack your things and move. We'll see what the future brings," Steve replied softly. Catherine's heart swelled with joy, and after a wonderful breakfast, she went to her room to pack her things and move them to the other side of the corridor. Over the next few nights, Steve had incipient nightmares, but as soon as he felt Catherine pressed against his back, the dream dissipated or turned into something less terrible. The first few nights, Catherine wore heavy nightwear and a sports bra, but it was too hot, so she started shedding her nightgown and slept in leggings and a sports bra. Steve wore a t-shirt and boxers. Catherine enjoyed the feeling of skin on skin. One morning, Steve woke up to the feeling of Catherine's hand on his bare chest under his t-shirt and the softness of her breasts pressing against his back. Something began to awaken in his lower body. He felt embarrassed. Carefully, he climbed out of bed and went to the bathroom and then to the kitchen. It was hot, very hot. The house was like an oven, despite the air conditioning. Steve still had nightmares, and Catherine and he still slept in the same bed together. This evening, Catherine decided to wear only a thin nightgown. They fell asleep, but it was a restless sleep due to the heat. Steve stood up and turned off the air conditioning. He closed the mosquito nets in all the rooms and opened the windows. The soft night breeze was pleasant, and he returned to bed, snuggled close to Catherine, and fell asleep happily. Catherine slowly woke up. Something was wrong. Their usual spooning position, pressing against Steve's back, was reversed. Steve pressed himself against her back and held her breasts, just like when they were still happily married. Then they had sex. After a long and tender act of love, they lay next to each other, enjoying the silence and closeness of each other. "I love you so much," Catherine whispered, looking into his eyes. Steve smiled and replied, "I love you too. I'm glad we're back together." They fell asleep, hugging each other, and the next day a new chapter of their lives began, full of hopes and promises for the future. 8 months later, 4 women, 1 man, and 1 baby were sitting in the living room. One of the women handed the baby to his older sister so that she could help him burp after feeding. Miranda said sweetly, "Anthony, little brother, show them how good you can burp." When Anthony showed off his skills, she took him upstairs to bathe him and put him to bed. Catherine looked at the 2 pregnant women, Noah, already heavily pregnant, and Patricia, who was 4 months along. By allowing Miranda to be present for Anthony's birth, we made the best decision other than getting married again. She was so impressed by the birth of a new life that she decided to become a midwife. She finally had a purpose in life. For me, life couldn't be better. I have my man again, and I am completely in love with him. Steve added, "I completely agree. I'm exactly where I want to be. Here, with my wife, children, and the best company I can imagine." And subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.